to have an opportunity to listen to one of our distinguished honorary fellows, Professor Nanak Akwani. He is going to speak on an issue which has been assuming importance for the last maybe 2 decades, 2.5 decades plus. I think today it is re-emerging as issue of more importance. And Professor Kakwani, I think this is an opportunity for we in the GIFT community to thank you for accepting our invitation to be one of our distinguished fellows and to formally welcome you to the community. Had there been no COVID and no travel restrictions, this would have been a face-to-face physical meeting, and we would have definitely had a nice dinner with you today evening. I think these are all things that, such nice things, we are not able to kind of have under the different times, under these difficult times. But nonetheless, it's our hope that sooner than later, we will be able to have you with us, and my colleagues and students will have the opportunity to get benefited from your enormous amount of work and your huge academic experience and expertise, which is very much closely linked to the mandate of the institute. And you know, as far as our state is concerned, it is very different, not only in terms of high human development indicators. You may be aware that at the national level, we have almost done away with the planning and planning commissions and 5-year plans. And this is the only state which has reiterated the role of the state under the difficult times like these and going ahead with the 14th 5-year plan, and in which it is upholding the role of the state in terms of ensuring that the planning and the growth and the prosperity that is coming up, that is emerged, that is coming out of it is shared one, such that the issue of poor remaining poor is no more the situation here. So I'm extremely happy that we are extremely happy that you have taken a topic of much relevance today, because what I said is that, you know, after many of the developing countries shifted their policy pendulum from what is called import substitution to export orientation and limited role for the state in the what is called the 80s and early 90s, you know that many of them managed to what is called to learn the art of cooking high growth rates. Earlier in the 80s, when Southeast Asian countries recorded high growth, or for that matter, South Korea joined the rank of OECD countries within a matter of 25 years, we all in the large economies thought that, okay, these are all small country syndrome. You look at South Korea, Singapore, or Taiwan. But today, as you are, I mean, you happy that you mentioned the case of China. We have a country like China that recorded a great growth rate nearly 10%, 9.7% for 47 years. But we also seen that the growth has not been leading to shared prosperity. And multilateral organizations, DFID and many other funding agencies, this is a major problem. In fact, you may be happy to know that some of our, you know, the question of proper growth or inclusive growth, I would say that inclusive growth is an Indian term. That is what I was told that it is our Ishwarja Jaluwalia. He has the credit of coining that term. That's what I was told. So we in India have got a lot of concern for that, and we are extremely happy that in the current juncture with the COVID effects, Those who have been left behind are still left behind. Those in the informal, in the unorganized, and such people are the people who have taken the burnt of COVID-19 pandemic. So I think the poor growth is becoming an issue of much concern today, and you could not have taken a better topic today with your expertise on progressivity in taxation and other things. Those areas are very close to our heart, and we are extremely happy that you are going to talk about this important topic of today. And with these words, I would like to once again, most warmly and with a lot of affection, welcome you to the GIFT community and invite you to deliver your lecture. Thank you. Over to you, Professor Kakwani.
Thank you, Professor Joseph, for your kind introduction. Let me first, set up my PowerPoint before I start my lecture. Is Zakaria, are you there?
Yes, sir, I am here.
Can you help me how to, share
Y-
the screen and
Yeah,
PowerPoint?
you can click the green. We can see your screen now, but you have to actually open the PowerPoint. Then we will be able to see it.
Oh, I thought I opened the PowerPoint. Let me do it again.
No, we can't see your PowerPoint.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, put the PowerPoint on the screen. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Yeah, we are good now. We can see it.
Oh, you can see it now. Okay, good.
Yeah, but you can put it in a presentation mode.
Yep.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's it.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay. In this lecture, I will be talking about how pro-poor growth evolved. As Professor Joseph pointed out, that the term came into existence about 2 decades ago. It was late 90s when people started talking about pro-poor growth. So at that time, I was appointed as a consultant, staff consultant at the Asian Development Bank. So where they were talking about pro-poor growth, many, UNDP and other agencies were talking about it, but they did not have very clear idea of what pro-poor growth is. So I started working on that at the ADB, and I was the first person to define what pro-poor growth is. But before I go into pro-poor growth, let me say that poverty in the world has existed for many centuries, and it continues to live in most developing countries. Now, it was actually more than 100 years ago, to be exact, 1901, Rowntree, a sociologist in England, he made a big study on poverty line, on poverty. He defined families in primary poverty if their total income is insufficient to obtain the minimum necessities of merely physical efficiency. So first he estimated the minimum money cost of food, satisfying the average nutritional needs for the families of different sizes. And then he added the rent paid and specific minimum amounts of clothing, fuel, and sundries to arrive at a poverty line of a family of a given size. So the total cost of maintaining minimum necessities of merely physical efficiency is called the poverty line. And family is classified as poor if its total income is less than the poverty line from its poverty. Now, let me now narrate a story which is not very much well known in India, that although India became independence in 1947, its development agenda was started in 1938, when Indian National Congress constituted a National Planning Committee, which consists of renowned industrialists, financiers, economists, professors, and representatives of the trade union. And Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was the chairman of the committee. So the primary focus of this committee was to alleviate poverty in India when it achieves independence from the British Raj. So I thought this story is relevant when I discuss the pro-poor growth. So to achieve the minimum standard of living, committee estimated in 1938 that a family would require rupees 15 to 20 per person per month to enjoy minimum standard of living. The family was regarded as poor if its per capita income was unable to enjoy this minimum standard of living. But even this low minimum standard of living, 15 to 20 rupees per person per month, a large percentage of population suffered acute poverty in India. So interestingly, the committee viewed growth as a means to provide minimum standard of living to the population. The committee estimated that countries' output needed to increase by 500 to 600% in 10 years to achieve this minimum standard of living. Now, can you imagine 500 to 600% in 10 years, which means that economic growth has to be around 50%, 50 to 60% per annum. I mean, which is enormous task to eliminate poverty in India. But committee also suggested that to increase this production, there had to be more equitable distribution of wealth. Committee didn't talk about equal distribution of income, but only equitable distribution of wealth. Now, there have been many efforts to define poverty line in India. I remember Dandekar, Rath, they did some work on that. But more recently, Tendulkar poverty line is most widely used, as you already know that. Now, let me take you back to the 50s and 60s. In 50s and 60s, the dominant development thinking was that economic growth was a factor. Economic growth was a factor in poverty reduction. So idea was that rich can invest in the economy to enhance economic growth through an increase in productivity. And then rich initially reap higher benefits of growth through their investment. But then in the second round, poor begin to benefit when rich starts spending their riches. So eventually, the benefits of economic growth will lead to reduction in poverty. So this was the policy which was prevalent in 1950s and 60s. Thus, the view that development economics was that government strategy for poverty reduction should promote investment, increase production capabilities, and enhance economic growth. The government need not concern with how economic growth distributes benefits among the people. That was known as trickle-down strategy, as you must have been aware of that. But everything changed. In the early 1970s, trickle-down theory lost some of its shine. As you know, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, he was my boss at the World Bank when I was working there. So Ahluwalia, Carter, and Chenry, they brought out a paper in 1979, and their concern was that world output expanded at an unprecedented rate in past quarter of the century, but benefits of growth did not reach the poor. The benefits of growth reached the poor to a very minimal degree. And this failure happened because distribution patterns left behind the poor. So it seems that in the 90s, consensus developed among the development practitioners that pro-poor growth would be required to achieve rapid reduction in poverty. And this represented a significant departure from trickle-down phenomenon. Despite of this consensus, trickle-down development strategy continued until new millennium. I mean, very interesting thing happened that when I was at the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank economists, Dollar and Cray, they brought out a working paper called Growth is Good for the Poor. This paper was later published in 2002. So again, this paper supported the trickle-down theory, concluding that poor's income rises 1-for-1 with overall growth. If growth is 1%, poor's income also increases by 1%. So their study, they did cross-country. Their study was based on cross-country regressions, and they estimated their relations using the sample of 80 countries for 4 decades. So they collected enormous amount of data to prove that growth is good for the poor. So clear message of this study was that government need not follow pro-poor policies. They should maximize economic growth, provided they avoid inflation and maintain fiscal discipline. This strategy became very controversial at that time. In Asian Development Bank, we had an international seminar where this issue was discussed, and there were a lot of criticism of the World Bank study. Now, then Oxfam in 2000, in an unpublished note, they criticized this World Bank findings. And they were very critical. They even said that World Bank's new development policy reflects an ideological desire to return the golden age of free market economies in the 80s. And that is terrible news for poverty reduction. So this was an interesting development when some of the agencies, some of the development partner agencies were talking about pro-poor growth. that growth is not sufficient to reduce poverty. And then World Bank came out with this finding, So this study derives its conclusions from cross-country regression models. I have reviewed this study in one of the papers published in a special issue in Asian Development Bank. The study suffered from conceptual and measurement problems, so its findings were not robust. Furthermore, the cross-country regressions can only give you the average picture for the whole world, depending on what sample you take. But individual experiences can be significantly different. So therefore, these conclusions, the policy are made at individual country level, not the average of the world, So these conclusions have no policy relevance. So now I come to evolution of pro-poor growth, which I started working on this in the Asian Development Bank in 2000, maybe 1999. And this term pro-poor growth emerged in late 90s, and many development practitioners began talking about it, but they did not have precise, concise definitions of pro-poor growth. Now, United Nations in 2000, OECD in 2001 defined pro-poor growth that benefits to the poor and provides them with the opportunity to improve their economic situation. Now, Asian Development Bank developed in 1999 its poverty reduction strategy, according to which growth is pro-poor when it is labor absorbing and accompanied by policies and programs that mitigate inequalities and facilitate income and employment generations for the poor, particularly women and other traditionally excluded groups. So this was a very general definition. And I found that these definitions were very vague, and you could not develop, could not measure the pro-poor growth using these general definitions. So I started working on this. So in this lecture, I will critically provide an assessment of alternative definitions of pro-poor growth and proposes a method of operationalizing it. Now, there are three main definitions which I will discuss now. One is the relative pro-poor growth. This is a paper I wrote for Asian Development Bank, Kakwani, and Pernia. We propose that pro-poor growth is a strategy that is deliberately biased in favor of the poor. Thus, their precise definition was that growth is pro-poor if it benefits the poor proportionally more than the rich. The growth results in redistribution of income in favor of the poor. So this strategy is biased in favor of the poor. And when there's a negative growth, the pro-poor growth implies that loss of income from recession, when there's a negative growth, then people lose their income. So loss of income from recession is proportionally less for the poor than the non-poor, then it is pro-poor. But if poor suffers proportionally more loss of income, then it will be anti-poor. So this Kakwani-Pernia definition is a relative definition of pro-poor growth because it contributes to reduction in relative inequality. So then in 2008, Kakwani and Son, we propose an absolute pro-poor growth. An absolute pro-poor growth, if the poor enjoy greater absolute benefits from the growth than the non-poor. Similar to taxation, that in taxation, that when rich people pay proportionally more tax, when absolute progressivity means that rich people pay taxes in absolute terms, more taxes than the poor. So similar idea here, that absolute pro-poor growth. And when growth is negative, the pro-poor growth entails a smaller absolute loss of income for the poor than the non-poor. So absolute pro-poor growth reduces absolute inequality. Therefore, it is a stronger requirement than the relative pro-poor growth. Almost similar time, 2003, Ravalian and Chen, two World Bank economists again. I mean, it's very interesting that World Bank economists were talking about poverty reduction and pro-poor growth, but at the same time, they also published Dollar and Craze study, which says that growth is the only thing to reduce poverty. So Ravalian and Chen defined growth as a pro-poor if it reduces poverty. But they did not specify how much should be the poverty reduction for growth to be pro-poor. I mean, growth can be pro-poor even if poor enjoy the tiny fraction of the benefits than the non-poor, as long as it reduces poverty. So there can be, huge disparity between poor and non-poor, but still poverty can reduce. Maybe household small, maybe small reduction. So the rich may get enormous benefits, but poor may get only tiny benefits. So this was we call it poverty reducing growth. So these are the three definitions. Relative pro-poor growth, where poor benefits proportionally more than the non-poor. Absolute pro-poor growth, when poor benefits more in absolute terms more than the non-poor. And poverty reducing growth, when growth reduces poverty, it doesn't matter how much inequality it increases. So these are the three basic definitions which are used to measure pro-poor growth. Now let me, that pro-poor growth deals with the interrelationship between poverty, inequality, and growth, this interrelationship. Actually, if you recall, in 1955, Kuznets, he published an article in American Economic Review where he talked about that growth initial stages with economic development, inequality increases and then it decreases. So that's known as a well-known inverted U-shaped curve, Kuznets inverted U-shaped curve. But Kuznets did not consider the issue of poverty. But the pro-poor growth is the interrelationship between three factors: poverty, inequality, and growth. So literature, it is now also called PIG, P-I-G axis. So let me now, so poverty measure can be characterized by the following equation. Supposing theta is any poverty measure, which can be a percentage of poor, a poverty gap ratio, and so on. It depends on three factors. One is the poverty line. Z is the poverty line. If poverty line is fixed, then we call it absolute poverty, but we can have a relative poverty too, but I will be presenting only the absolute poverty, which is the most relevant measure of poverty. And mu is the mean income. Mean income or mean consumption, it measures the average standard of living. So economic growth contributes to increase in average standard of living. And LP is a Lawrence curve, which is sort of a measure of equity in income distribution. 1 minus LP is a inequality curve, IP, which measures the inequality. So these three factors. So in the case of trickle down theory, we say that you just focus on mu and don't worry, the effect of distribution or Lorentz curve, shift in Lorentz curve is insignificant. So then poverty will reduce rapidly if you just focus on mean. But there are two factors. So obviously growth cannot be sufficient to reduce poverty. So in this, if Lorentz curve does not change, which means the inequality does not change, then as mean income increases, then poverty reduces. But if mu remains the same, if Lorentz curve shifts downward or it increases the inequality, then poverty must increase when inequality increases. So this is a fundamental equation of the poverty, that there are three factors: poverty line, mean income, and LP, the Lorentz curve. So now I will just focus on, very famous, the Foster, Greer, and Thorbec's poverty measures. But there are now many, the Saints poverty measures, and there are, there's a huge literature on poverty measures. But for this presentation, I will just talk about three measures. One is the head count ratio. Okay, this is the class of Foster, Greer, and Thorbec's poverty measure. So when alpha is equal to 0, we get a head count ratio. When alpha is equal to 1, we get a poverty gap ratio. And when alpha is equal to 2, we get severity of poverty. So these are the additively decomposable poverty measures. But Saints poverty measures take into account the relative deprivation which suffered when poor compared with other poor. So let me not go into that. This is sufficient for me in this lecture to present these Foster, Greer, and Thorbecke measures. Now, I want to present to you a general framework of poor growth, which was developed by Kakwani and Son in 2008 in the Review of Income and Wealth. Now, this delta is the growth rate in poverty. So delta is the poverty growth rate, and it consists of two factors. This first term has two sources. Gamma is the growth rate in mean income, and this eta is the elasticity, growth elasticity of poverty. Its interpretation is that if there's a growth of 1%, then poverty will reduce by this eta percent, provided everybody in the society receives the same proportional benefits of the growth, which means that inequality does not change. So this is a component where inequality does not change, but there's only the growth effect. So this is the growth effect of poverty. And this growth effect will always be negative, because if there's a positive growth rate, and if everybody gets the same proportion of income from the growth, then poverty must reduce. So this will be a negative. But now this factor, second factor, is called the inequality effect or redistribution effect. It means that if this term is positive, then poverty will increase. And if this term is negative, poverty will decrease. So this measures the redistribution of income. The growth accompanies redistribution of income. And if it favors the poor, then it is negative. And if it favors the rich, non-poor, then it is positive. So this is the fundamental framework of pro-poor growth. So now you can see that again, coming back to this, gamma is the growth rate in mean income, and this is the elasticity. So this is the total effect on poverty due to pure growth effect, when there is no redistribution of income. And when there is a redistribution of income, then this effect starts playing, So this led us to propose a pro-poor growth index, which is defined as, phi is equal to delta divided by this. So numerator is the actual poverty change, and this is the change in poverty when everybody receives the same proportional benefits of growth. Growth, maybe you can say that this is a measure of inclusive growth, that everybody receiving the same proportional benefits of growth. Now, if phi is greater than 1, you can see that actual poverty reduction is more than the poverty reduction if everybody receives the same proportional benefits. So which means that growth will be pro-poor because the poverty reduction is higher than under the counterfactual that it was when everybody received the same proportional benefits. So if phi is greater than 1, then actual poverty reduction is higher than the poverty reduction occurring when growth process provides the same proportional benefits to everyone. So phi greater than 1, growth is pro-poor in relative sense, and when phi is less than 1, growth is anti-poor. Now, if growth is negative, it is possible that gamma is negative. In that case, the phi, pro-poor growth phi must be less than 1 when growth is negative, which means that poor suffers less loss of income than the non-poor, then it is pro-poor. But if poor suffers greater loss of income due to recession or due to negative growth, then it is pro-poor. So this is a fundamental basic definition which we developed in 2000 for Asian Development Bank. And this attracted a lot of attention in the literature, this idea of pro-poor. This is a pro-poor index. Similarly, we can have a similar equation for absolute pro-poor growth. So this elasticity is the poverty elasticity, when there's a 1% increase in mean income, and everybody gets the same income, absolute income, then this will be the absolute elasticity of poverty. So similar equation, and therefore the pro-poor index will be actual poverty reduction divided by the poverty reduction if everybody received the same benefits of economic growth. So if this phi star is greater than 1, growth is absolute pro-poor, otherwise it is anti-poor. So this is a basic thing. Okay. Now, Ravalian and Chen, they define growth as pro-poor if it reduces poverty. So in our notation, if delta is negative, then there's a reduction in poverty. So delta is less than 0. That is their requirement, the Ravalian and Chen. And so this we call it as a poverty reducing growth. It implies that growth has pro-poor when it reduces poverty for both positive and negative growth rate. Now, okay, now these, two indices, relative and absolute pro-poor indices, when they are greater than 1, it is pro-poor, less than 1, it is anti-poor. So, but these indices do not inform us how much is the poverty reduction in growth, how much economic growth is contributing to poverty reduction. So in this respect, myself and Son, we developed the idea of poverty equivalent growth rate. This is a composite index of the two factors, that average growth rate, and there are two factors. That poverty depends on the growth rate in mean income and the distribution of growth benefits among the poor and non-poor. So this is a very important, that these are the two factors where the trickle-down phenomenon focuses only on the first factor, but there are two factors. Therefore, this poverty equivalent growth rate is the composite index of these two factors. So it is a product of this, that actually, developing this poverty equivalent growth rates, we use the idea of Atkinson's, equally distributed income level. So poverty equivalent growth rate is the growth rate that will result in the same growth in poverty as actual growth rate if growth process had not accompanied any change in inequality. So it will be the counterfactual growth rate if everyone in the society received the same proportional benefits. So from this we derive that pro-poor growth, gamma R, the relative pro-poor growth, is product of the phi and gamma. Gamma is the growth rate and mean income, and phi is how the benefits of growth are distributed. Similarly, we have a absolute pro-poor growth, where the product of the two, how the absolute benefits are distributed and the actual growth rate. So this is the idea of poverty equivalent growth rate. Let me give you an example, if I may, that supposing, this is a hypothetical example, suppose economic growth rate is 7%, okay? And it reduces poverty by 10%. So 7% growth reduces poverty by 10%, which means that delta will be equal to minus 0.10, because 10% reduction in poverty, and gamma, the growth in mean income, is 7%. Now, so supposing the growth elasticity of poverty is minus 1.2, so which is interpreted as 1% increase in mean income reduces poverty by 1.2%, provided the relative inequality had not changed. So the growth in poverty under the counterfactual that inequality had not changed will be, obviously, this elasticity times the growth rate, which will be about, so poverty reduction and under no change in inequality will be 8.4%. And actual poverty reduction is 10%, which means that pro-poor index is 1.19%. Hence, the poor enjoy 90% higher benefits than the non-poor. So the growth is pro-poor. Now, poverty equivalent growth is 8%, which is higher than the actual economic growth rate of 7%. Thus, there's a gain of 1% growth rate because the growth is pro-poor. So idea is, this is a very interesting idea, that when growth is pro-poor, there's a gain in growth rate, so there's a gain of 1% growth rate because it is pro-poor. But there can be, when if it is not pro-poor, then there will be loss of growth rate. So supposing supposing economy suffered a recession, growth is negative, and so the economic growth decreased by supposing 5%, implying that gamma is equal to minus 0.05, which led to increase in poverty, say, of 7%, so given delta is equal to 0.07. So if recession were inequality neutral, poverty would have increased by about 6%. And actual increase in poverty is 7%. So which shows that the pro-poor index is 1.17. It means that the poor suffer 70% higher loss of income than the non-poor. Therefore, recession is highly anti-poor. And poverty equivalent growth rate is minus 5.9%, which is lower than the actual growth rate of 5%. The society suffers a loss of growth rate equal to 0.9%. So this is the basic idea, intuitive idea of this pro-poor growth, that when the growth is pro-poor, then we actually effective growth rate is higher, we gain. But if growth is anti-poor, then we lose the growth. The effective growth is lower. So the pattern of growth, now we can define the pattern of growth. I'll quickly go through this, that this is the pro-poor growth. This is the equation, basically. Now, if growth is pro-poor, then second term, this term will be positive, which means that there will be gain in growth, gain in growth rate if it is pro-poor. But if it is anti-poor, when phi is less than 1, then there's a loss of growth. So this equation tells us that whether there's a gain or loss of the growth rate. Now let's see some, I have given some many different, scenarios that now if gamma is equal to greater than phi is greater than 1, it is positive growth rate, is pro-poor, it reduces poverty. Okay, now let me not go into details of this very clearly stated here. I straight away go to another, let me just point out that it's possible that a positive growth rate can lead to increase in poverty. This was the idea which I got from Bhagwati's paper in 1988. Immeasurizing growth, that he gives the idea of, big farmers and small farmers. And so the idea was that growth, positive growth rate can lead to increase in poverty. So growth is immeasurizing, that was the idea of Bhagwati. So which means that it puts a strong emphasis on pro-poor growth, the Bhagwati's idea. So I continue, this, but in this, I don't have to go into details of this, but I want to just point out that Keravalian's changed definition of pro-poor growth. If growth is positive, it is the weakest possible definition of pro-poor growth. And if growth is negative, it is the strongest growth rate. Let me give you some illustration that we compiled the data, growth patterns in 80 countries in 237 growth episodes, covering the period from 84 to 2001. The lot of episodes, 237 episodes. Surprisingly, we found that 106 episodes had negative growth, and 131 episodes had positive growth rates. So you see that you can have a lot of negative growth rates in the world, in different periods. Some periods they're negative, some positive. So we are taking the total 237 episodes, okay? So we found that incidence of poverty fell in 86% of all positive growth spells. If growth spells were positive, 86% of the cases, poverty declined in the world, 86%. Which means that according to Ravalian and Chain's definition, growth will be pro-poor in 86% of the cases, okay? The most growth process in the world will be deemed pro-poor according to their definition. Thus, the government can achieve pro-poor outcome by ensuring only that growth is positive. That's why, the 86% of the cases poverty will reduce. It means that government need not follow pro-poor policies as long as they achieve positive growth. Okay. Now, among negative episodes, 87% of the cases, the poverty increased, and only 13% of the cases poverty decreased. Thus, these results indicate that most growth episodes will be classified as pro-poor or anti-poor when growth is positive or negative, So the message is that you just achieve positive economic growth, then most of the cases poverty will decrease, and therefore growth is pro-poor. But that doesn't come out from our results, our definitions of absolute and relative pro-poor. So such outcomes may not guarantee a rapid poverty reduction. So government policies should enhance the poverty equivalent growth rates to rapidly decrease poverty, becoming an agenda for poverty reduction in developing countries. So it's the poverty equivalent growth rate is the main indicator which governments must maximize to achieve pro-poor growth. Now, let me give you some estimates of the Chinese issue. Now, in China, I did the study from 88 to 2018. Now, as you know, that China has achieved unprecedented high economic growth. Now, for almost, 88 to almost 2018, almost 3 decades, the per capita mean income in China increased at the annual rate of 7.08%. This is a trend growth rate in the mean income. So in this period, 6.5%, 3.14, and so for 3 decades, the average growth rate in China was 7.08%. And interestingly, the Gini index increased in every period, and average growth rate in Gini index was 0.87%. And percentage of poor, they reduced in every period, and so the percentage of poor reduced at the rate of 10.37%, 11.36, and 11.60. When we say severity of poverty, which means that ultra poor, poverty among the ultra poor is higher here. So the growth is benefiting more the ultra poor rather than the poor. That's the basic idea. So this 30 years, China had poverty reduction of more than 10% for entire 30 periods, which means that almost about China reduced its poverty by almost 1 billion people, in China, that. Now, how did they do it? Was the growth pro-poor? Now, you can see that from Gini index, the inequality has been increasing in China, but still there was a huge reduction in poverty. Now I want to emphasize that Gini index has no relationship with poverty reduction. increase in poverty. It is possible that there's no one-to-one relationship between poverty and Gini index. It is possible that Gini index increases and poverty reduces, or Gini index reduces, poverty increases. So you can get a very perverse results if you are using Gini index. But the idea which I'm giving here, that inequality effect and pro-poor growth effect, that has a one-to-one relationship, direct relationship with poverty. The inequality aspect has a direct relationship with poverty. Okay. Now here gives the poverty equivalent growth rates. If poverty equivalent growth rate is positive, then there's a reduction in poverty. So you can see here that these are all positive. So the percentage up to this pro-poor poverty equivalent growth rate has been declining, 5.84 and so on. So these are the indicators which determine. Now, sorry. Okay. Now, interesting here. Can you see the figures? These are the gains and losses of growth, Now you can see here that all are negative, which means that there's a loss of growth rate, that if you have a percentage of poor and a poverty measure, then there's a loss of growth, annual loss of growth in pro-poor growth is minus 1.24, and it increases to minus 2.21, which means that China growth has not been pro-poor at all. There are losses of growth, which means that growth is not pro-poor in China, but they have achieved very high poverty reduction. So in conclusion, emerging from China's story is that the growth is very important in China, that inequality, although increased every period, but its impact was relatively very small. But recent studies after 2013 and 18, we find that poverty is even increased in some period. So which means that China is approaching a point where it cannot continue with the growth policies. The growth will not be that effective. So China has to have poverty reduction strategy by directly targeting the poor. And they have a very big program, it's called DBAO in China, where it's a social welfare program. They transfer income to the poor to reduce poverty. And so I evaluated that program, and although that program contributed to reduction in poverty, but it was very inefficient. I found that China had to spend enormous amount of resources to target for about 40 million people who were regarded as poor. So this is a Chinese story, brief story. And so what we have done here is that growth consists of two factors, growth rate and distribution of benefits from growth. And poverty equivalent growth rate is the composite index of the two factors, satisfying essential requirement that it is a monotonically increasing function of poverty reduction. So it is a valuable metric, in my view, to achieve poverty reduction. Its message is that government can follow a mixture of growth and income distribution policies. Since the poverty reduction can be decomposed into growth and redistribution effects, so the government can empirically determine how much importance they give to each policy. So I'm saying that don't follow growth only policies, follow the mixture of the two policies, but how much weight you give to different policies comes out of this paper. Thank you.